Cory Booker is on a mission, and he's not backing down. In a historic Senate filibuster, Booker is doing what so many have failed to do, fighting for Black America and demanding justice for every forgotten voice. From tackling police brutality to protecting the future of Black children, Booker lays it all on the line, speaking truth to power like never before. But he's not just fighting for the young generation. Booker is fighting for the older folks too, the ones who worked hard all their lives, only to see their security threatened. He's standing tall for social security, for health care, and for the most vulnerable among us. Watch as Booker takes on the system, calling out corrupt politicians, tearing down the lies, and demanding real change. Will this be the turning point for Black America? Can he shake the system to its core? You don't want to miss this. Watch till the end to see if Cory Booker's fight will finally give America the justice it desperately needs. Cory Booker versus the system. The battle for Black America begins. Senator Cory Booker stood before the Senate, a fire burning in his eyes. The weight of history and the future of Black America rested on his shoulders. This wasn't just another political speech. It was a declaration that the fight for Black justice would not be silenced anymore. He wasn't just talking about policy or laws. He was fighting for the souls of those who've been oppressed for centuries, those who have been left behind by the system. Cory Booker knew this wasn't just about him. This was about every Black American who had ever been ignored, mistreated, or silenced. This was a moment of reckoning. Booker wasn't just raising his voice. He was raising a movement. He wasn't here to make empty promises. He was here to make history. And as he stood in that room, the tension was palpable. Booker wasn't playing by the old rules. The system had tried to crush the dreams of Black people, but he wasn't going to let it slide any longer. Every word he spoke was a punch thrown at the injustices Black Americans had endured for generations. And there was no turning back. As he spoke, Booker reminded everyone in that room of the horrors of America's past. How Black Americans had fought for their freedom, their equality, and their right to simply exist in a society that would often rather see them disappear. He wasn't just talking about history for the sake of nostalgia. He was connecting the dots between the past and the present, showing how deeply ingrained racism and inequality still were in the systems of power today. He wasn't pulling punches. Every word Booker spoke was a reminder that African Americans were still struggling, still facing obstacles that their white counterparts didn't even think about. From police brutality to economic disparities to the harsh reality that so many Black Americans faced every single day, Booker made it clear. This fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And yet, Booker wasn't just standing in protest. He was standing in hope. For every Black child in America who dreamed of a better life, for every elder who worked their whole life only to see their social security threatened, for every mother who just wanted her son to make it home without fear, Booker was speaking for them. His voice wasn't just about anger. It was about a call for justice, a call for unity, and a demand for real change. As he continued, it became clear this wasn't a moment of political grandstanding. This was a movement that would either change the course of history or be buried under the weight of a broken system. But Cory Booker wasn't going to let that happen. Not on his watch. Not while Black America still needed a voice in the Senate. As the Senate chamber fell silent, one thing was clear. Cory Booker wasn't just fighting for a political victory. He was fighting for a revolution. And as the battle for Black America began, all eyes were on him. The question was no longer whether Booker would make history, but whether the system would allow it to happen. Cory Booker exposes the truth. America can't keep hiding its history. Cory Booker wasn't just standing in front of the Senate to give another speech. He was about to do something far more powerful. He was going to force America to look at its own reflection and face the ugly truth that many still tried to ignore. The past, especially the history of Black America, wasn't some faded story locked in a textbook. It was alive, it was real, and it was still haunting this country. And Cory Booker was ready to make sure it wasn't erased or forgotten. In that Senate chamber, Booker took a deep breath and made it clear the fight for Black America wasn't just about the present. It was about the past, too. He wasn't going to let anyone pretend that the legacy of slavery, segregation, and oppression was behind them. It wasn't. The scars of history were still fresh, and they were still impacting every part of Black life in America. From the prison system to economic inequality, from education to healthcare, the past had left an indelible mark on Black people's future, and Booker wasn't going to let the Senate sweep it under the rug. He pointed out that for far too long, America had tried to whitewash its history, sanitizing the hard truths in favor of a fairy tale version of its story. Booker wasn't having it. He knew that the American dream was built on the backs of enslaved Black men and women, and that history couldn't be forgotten no matter how uncomfortable it made people feel. Every effort to erase the history of Black America was an insult to those who had fought and died for the freedoms many took for granted today. As Booker spoke, he made it clear that he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for pity. He was demanding respect. Respect for the contributions Black Americans had made to this country, despite centuries of oppression. He wasn't just defending the history of Black America. He was defending its right to be remembered, to be honored, and to be acknowledged as an integral part of the American experience. Every word that Booker spoke was an attempt to tear down the walls of denial that had been built around the truth. He wasn't just talking about the past in abstract terms. He was connecting it to the present, showing how the chains of history had manifested in today's systems of inequality. Booker made it clear that the fight for justice didn't end with civil rights. It had to continue every single day until the structures of oppression were dismantled once and for all. The Senate chamber was silent as Booker's words landed with the weight of history itself. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. The fight he was waging wasn't just about laws and policies. It was about the soul of America. Would America finally reckon with its past, or would it continue to hide behind lies and denial? As Booker stood tall, the question was clear. Would this speech, this call for accountability, be the catalyst for real change, or would it be buried beneath the weight of apathy and inaction? With every passing moment, Booker made it harder to ignore the reality Black Americans faced, and the world would be forced to reckon with the truth. The story of Black America couldn't be erased anymore, not as long as Cory Booker had a voice in the Senate. Cory Booker slams the system. Black Lives Matter now more than ever. Senator Cory Booker wasn't holding back anymore. The gloves were off, and he was coming for the system like it had never been confronted before. He wasn't just talking about policies or politics. He was talking about real lives, real struggles, and the kind of injustice that had plagued Black America for generations. Booker's words were sharp, his voice unwavering, as he tore into the heart of the nation's broken systems. Booker wasn't afraid to call it like it was. He stood in that chamber, eyes focused and steady, as he boldly called out the injustice Black Americans faced every single day. He didn't mince words. The prison system, the school-to-prison pipeline, the police brutality, Booker made it clear that these weren't just problems. These were crises. Crises that Black Americans were forced to deal with on a daily basis. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the result of years of systemic racism that had been built into the very foundations of this country. And Booker wasn't going to let anyone ignore it any longer. He knew that for too long, the stories of Black Americans had been ignored. When a Black man was gunned down by police, when a Black child was given less opportunity, when a Black family was crushed by the weight of systemic inequality, the nation turned a blind eye. Booker wasn't having it. He wasn't going to let Black America's pain be swept under the rug anymore. He wasn't just speaking for the people who were watching. He was speaking for every Black mother who feared for her son's life, every Black child who wondered if their future was even possible, every Black elder who worked their whole life and was still struggling to survive. But Booker didn't just talk about the problem. He offered a solution. He called on America to do better. He demanded that those in power stop pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. He demanded action, accountability, and justice. No more pretending that the system wasn't broken. No more pretending that Black lives didn't matter. In that moment, it became clear Cory Booker wasn't just fighting for Black America's survival. He was fighting for its future. He wasn't just speaking to his colleagues in the Senate. He was speaking to every black person who had ever been made to feel less than, who had ever been told they didn't matter, who had ever been forced to live in a world that was stacked against them. And his message was clear. It was time to fight back. This wasn't just a speech. It was a call to arms. Booker wasn't going to let the system keep grinding black Americans down. He wasn't going to let the powers that be silence the voices of those who had been struggling for too long. And as he stood there, speaking truth to power, it was impossible to ignore the fact that this was the beginning of something much bigger. This wasn't just a moment in time. It was the start of a movement that would demand justice for black America and make sure that their voices could never be silenced again. As Booker's words echoed through the chamber, one thing became crystal clear. This was only the beginning. The battle for black America's future had just begun, and Cory Booker was leading the charge. No more excuses. No more denial. It was time for change, and Cory Booker was going to make sure it happened. Cory Booker takes on Trump. Black America won't be silent anymore. Senator Cory Booker wasn't just taking on the Senate anymore. He was going straight for the heart of the Trump administration. As the hours ticked by in his filibuster, Booker went from calling out the usual political games to taking aim at the very man who had been making life hell for black Americans. Booker wasn't about to let Trump's lies slide. He was going to expose them, one by one. The stakes were high, and Booker knew it. Black America was being put under attack, and he wasn't going to let it happen without a fight. The country was watching as Booker called out Trump's broken promises. From the moment he took office, Trump had promised to make life better for Americans, but for black America, all it had done was get worse. Booker's words were fiery and urgent as he reminded everyone of Trump's so-called promises. He promised to lower your grocery prices, Booker said, but they're higher than ever. He talked about the promise to make the economy better, but all it had done was hurt the most vulnerable. Black communities were suffering more than ever under Trump's policies, and Booker wasn't going to let him off the hook. But it wasn't just about policy anymore. It was personal. Booker brought up Trump's racist rhetoric, his inflammatory words, and the way he had treated black America since day one. Trump didn't just ignore black lives. He actively worked to suppress them. From his attacks on black athletes to his refusal to condemn white supremacy, Trump's actions were loud and clear. He didn't care about the struggles of black Americans. And Booker wasn't going to sit back while this man continued to tear apart the fabric of the nation. Booker wasn't just fighting for the future. He was fighting for the dignity of every black American who had been stripped of their worth by this administration. He took aim at the very core of Trump's rhetoric, exposing how his lies had led to real pain for real people. Trump had promised to make America great again, but for black Americans, that meant a step backwards. It meant rising racial tensions, rising inequality, and rising hate. Booker was done letting those promises slide. But Booker didn't just call out Trump. He put the entire system on notice. He wasn't going to stand by while one man, with all his power and privilege, tried to take away what black America had fought for. Booker knew this was bigger than just Trump. This was about a system that had been broken for centuries, and Trump was just a symptom of a larger problem. But Booker wasn't afraid to face it head on. He was calling for change, not just in the White House, but in every part of America that had allowed this to happen. By now, it was clear Booker wasn't just standing in the Senate because he had to. He was there because he had no choice. He had seen the damage that Trump had done to black America, and he wasn't going to let it continue. Booker's voice was a beacon of hope, a rallying cry for every person who had been left behind by this country's broken promises. The hours were ticking by, but Cory Booker wasn't slowing down. The more he spoke, the more the stakes became clear. This wasn't just a battle for policy. It was a battle for the soul of America. And Cory Booker was standing at the forefront of the fight. Cory Booker's bold call for a new dream. Black America deserves more. As Cory Booker stood on the Senate floor, hours into his filibuster, it became clear that this wasn't just about opposing policies. It was about rewriting the American dream itself. Booker wasn't content with the status quo, and he wasn't afraid to say it loud and clear. The American dream that had been promised to so many was a dream that Black America had been locked out of for far too long. And Booker was done letting that slide. He was calling for something new, something better, something that could actually uplift those who had been left behind. For Booker, the dream wasn't about wealth or power. It was about freedom and equality. But for Black America, freedom had always been a fight. From slavery to segregation to modern-day systemic racism, Black people had been denied access to the very dream they had been told was theirs. Booker knew this wasn't just about giving speeches. It was about giving people something real, something tangible. He was fighting for a future where Black children could dream without fear, without the weight of history holding them down. But Booker wasn't just talking about Black America's struggles. He was talking about its future. He wasn't here to just condemn the past. He was here to build something better. He was calling for a new dream, one that didn't just offer a seat at the table, but build a whole new table. He wasn't going to settle for crumbs, not when so many people had fought for so long for the full meal. Booker wasn't about offering empty promises. He was demanding real change, change that would give Black Americans a fair shot at that dream. As Booker's words filled the Senate chamber, there was no mistaking the urgency in his voice. He knew that Black Americans weren't just fighting for a seat in this country. They were fighting for their right to even exist in a system that had been designed to ignore them, to push them to the side. Booker wasn't going to let that happen. He was standing up for every Black mother who feared for her son's future, for every Black father who worked long hours just to get by, for every Black child who dreamed of a future but didn't know if they would be allowed to live it. But Booker wasn't just speaking for today. He was speaking for tomorrow, too, for the next generation of Black leaders, thinkers, and dreamers. He was challenging America to live up to its promises, to make the American dream a reality for every single person, regardless of their race, background, or where they came from. He was calling for bold action, for big ideas that could unite this divided nation, not just for Black America, but for every American who felt left out, left behind, or forgotten. Booker wasn't going to let the dream die. He was going to fight for it, no matter how long it took. With every passing moment, Booker's call for a new dream became more urgent. He wasn't asking for handouts. He was demanding respect, dignity, and justice for Black America. He was done with the empty promises and the fake gestures of goodwill. He wanted something real, something that could change the trajectory of millions of lives. This was bigger than politics. It was bigger than policy. This was about the soul of the nation, and Cory Booker was going to make sure that Black America had a place in it. As the hours wore on, Booker wasn't slowing down. The more he spoke, the more the stakes became clear. This wasn't just a fight for Black America. It was a fight for the very future of the American dream. And Cory Booker wasn't going to rest until that dream was something everyone could reach for, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. The battle for a new dream had only just begun. Cory Booker fights for Black lives. Is America ready for the truth? As the hours stretched on in Cory Booker's marathon filibuster, the pressure in the Senate chamber was palpable. The stakes were higher than ever. Booker wasn't just defending policies. He was standing up for Black America. He was speaking for the millions who were ignored, oppressed, and marginalized by a system that had long been rigged against them. It wasn't enough to merely talk about change. Booker knew it was time to make America face the raw, uncomfortable truth about how Black lives were treated in this country. Every word that Booker spoke was a call for justice, not just for Black America, but for every American who had been left behind by the very systems that were supposed to protect them. He didn't just stand up for the right to live. He stood up for the right to thrive. He stood up for the future, a future where Black Americans could walk through the world without fear, where they didn't have to worry about being brutalized by police, gunned down in their streets, or targeted by an unfair system. Booker was calling out the heart of the problem, the fact that America had never fully dealt with its history of racism. Booker's voice carried through the Senate, cutting through the noise of politics as usual. He wasn't playing games. The problem wasn't just about isolated incidents or individual bad actors. It was systemic. It was institutional. And Booker wasn't going to let anyone pretend that it wasn't. From police violence to unequal access to health care, from poverty to mass incarceration, the system was designed to keep Black Americans at the bottom, and Booker was determined to fight back. The longer Booker spoke, the more his words started to sink in. He wasn't just railing against the system. He was calling for real change. He was demanding that America do more than just offer lip service to the idea of equality. He wanted action. He wanted policies that would stop Black Americans from being treated as second-class citizens. He wanted a country where Black kids didn't grow up thinking their futures were limited simply because of their skin color. But Booker wasn't just fighting for today. He was fighting for the future. He knew that the only way to build a better world for Black Americans was to dismantle the systems that kept them oppressed. He wasn't asking for handouts. He was demanding the right to stand on equal footing with everyone else in this country. He wanted a world where Black Americans could live their lives without fear, without discrimination, without constantly having to fight just to be treated as human. It wasn't just about words anymore. It was about creating a movement that would push past the comfort of the status quo and demand justice for Black lives. And Booker wasn't going to back down until it happened. He wasn't going to stop fighting until the system was forced to reckon with the truth of how it had failed Black Americans. The room was silent as Booker's words echoed in the chamber. Everyone knew the truth he was speaking was undeniable. There was no more hiding behind excuses or pretending things were fine. Cory Booker was forcing America to look at the ugly reality of how Black Americans had been treated for centuries, and he wasn't going to let anyone look away. As the hours passed, one thing became clear. Cory Booker wasn't just fighting for policies. He was fighting for Black America's very survival. And he was making sure that everyone in that room knew it. The battle for justice wasn't over. But with Booker leading the charge, there was hope. A hope that one day, Black lives would finally matter. Not just in words, but in action. Cory Booker demands more. Black America's future is non-negotiable. As the Senate floor grew colder and the hours dragged on, Cory Booker's mission had become clearer than ever. This wasn't just about the present. It was about the future of Black America. Booker wasn't going to let the next generation of Black children suffer the same injustices, the same lack of opportunity that his ancestors had. He wasn't there for half measures or watered-down promises. The fight was bigger than politics. It was about the future of a whole community, and Booker knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime moment to finally demand what Black America had been denied for too long. In those long hours, Booker wasn't just addressing his colleagues in the Senate. He was addressing the entire nation. He was standing up for every Black family who had been robbed of their dignity, their rights, and their opportunities by a system built on inequality. Booker's words were a declaration. Black America deserved more, and they weren't going to accept less. Not anymore. What Booker understood better than anyone else was that this wasn't about one election or one policy. It was about a cultural shift. A shift that would challenge the core of America's racist systems and fight for a future where Black Americans didn't have to work twice as hard to achieve half as much. The promises of equality had been made time and time again, but the results had always fallen short. Booker wasn't going to accept that anymore. He wasn't asking for change, he was demanding it, and he wasn't going to stop until he got it. For Booker, this was about the next generation, the ones who were growing up today in a world where they were still judged by the color of their skin. He wasn't going to let them inherit the same struggles that their parents and grandparents had faced. He wasn't going to let the cycle of poverty, discrimination, and violence continue. Every word that Booker spoke was a challenge to America. What are you going to do for these kids? What will you give them? Booker's fight wasn't just political, it was personal. He knew what it was like to live in a world that treated you differently because of your race. He'd seen it firsthand, felt it in his bones, and now he was using his position to make sure those struggles didn't define his people's future. He wasn't just fighting for legislation or speeches. He was fighting for Black children to grow up in a world that respected their humanity. He was fighting for them to feel safe in their communities, to know that their dreams weren't limited by the color of their skin. But Booker's message was clear. This fight wasn't just his, it was everyone's fight. It was up to every American to decide if they were going to stand by and let the system keep crushing Black America, or if they were going to step up and make sure that the future was different. Booker wasn't going to be a politician who just told people what they wanted to hear. He was going to demand more, push for more, and make sure that America couldn't keep pretending everything was okay when it wasn't. And as Booker's voice echoed through the Senate, it was impossible to ignore. Black America was done with empty promises. They weren't going to accept scraps anymore. They were going to demand their place at the table, and Booker wasn't going to stop until they got it. The fight wasn't over, but with Booker leading the charge, there was hope. Hope that Black America's future could finally be what it deserved. Hope that change was coming, and it was coming now. Cory Booker's final stand. Is America ready for the change he's fighting for? After hours of relentless speech, Cory Booker stood tall, his voice hoarse, but his conviction stronger than ever. The fight wasn't over, but the message had been sent loud and clear. This was no longer just about one man, one speech, or even one policy. This was about a movement that couldn't be ignored, a movement that would not rest until Black America had what it deserved. Booker had poured everything into this moment, and as he stood in that Senate chamber, it was clear this wasn't just a fight for today, it was a fight for the future. Booker wasn't just speaking to the Senate anymore. His words were reaching every corner of the nation, from the streets of inner cities to the rural areas where Black Americans lived in silence. His voice had become a beacon of hope for those who had been left behind for too long. The stakes had never been higher, and Booker knew it. Black America had been crying out for justice, for equality, for a chance to live without fear. And Cory Booker was the one standing up, refusing to let those cries go unheard. The passion in his voice was undeniable. Booker wasn't here to talk. He was here to make change. His words weren't just for the history books. They were for every Black American who had ever been told their dreams were impossible, for every family who had been pushed down by a system that didn't care about their survival. He was calling for a new day, one where Black Americans wouldn't have to fight for every inch of progress. But as the hours ticked by and the fatigue set in, Booker's fight wasn't just about standing tall in front of the Senate. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it seemed like the whole system was stacked against you. This wasn't just politics, it was personal. Booker knew the pain, the fear, and the anger that so many Black Americans carried every single day. And he wasn't going to let that pain be ignored any longer. This was a man who had seen it all. The broken promises, the empty speeches, the systemic injustice that had been perpetuated for generations. But Booker wasn't here to settle for the same old rhetoric. He was here to break the system, to demand something better, something real. His words weren't just for his colleagues in the Senate. They were for every single person who had ever felt small, silenced, or pushed aside. Booker wasn't going to let that happen anymore. As the speech reached its final moments, the weight of his words was impossible to ignore. Booker wasn't just talking about the issues of the day. He was talking about the soul of America. He was talking about the future, the one that could be built if America was willing to look at its past and finally do something about it. This wasn't just Cory Booker's fight. It was the fight of every person who believed in justice, in equality, and in the right to live free from the weight of racism. The chamber was silent, the air heavy with the realization that this was more than just one senator's stand. This was a rallying cry, a call to arms for anyone who believed that the status quo wasn't good enough. Booker had shown what it meant to fight for what was right, no matter the odds. Now, it was up to the rest of America to decide whether they would stand with him or let his words fade into silence. The future of Black America was on the line, and Cory Booker wasn't backing down. As the Senate floor cleared, one thing was certain: the fight wasn't over. But with Booker leading the charge, there was hope. Hope that the changes America desperately needed could finally become a reality. Cory Booker's final stand. Will the elderly in Black America get the justice they deserve? Cory Booker's marathon filibuster wasn't just a speech, it was a reckoning. For hours, Booker stood in the Senate, fighting for Black America, for every elder who had worked their whole life, only to see their future threatened. He wasn't just talking about policy. He was talking about human lives, about the sacrifices of those who had fought for justice, equality, and dignity for decades. Black Americans and the elderly were being left behind, and Booker wasn't going to let that continue. His words were a call to action, a demand for real change. As he faced the system, it was clear this was more than a fight for today. It was a fight for tomorrow. The question now is, will America listen? Will the system finally act? Or will Cory Booker's powerful voice be drowned out by the same old politics? The fight for justice is far from over, but with Booker leading the charge, there's hope. If you believe in justice, equality, and fighting for those who need it most, hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and ring the bell. Don't miss what's coming next.